Hi guys, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the way that the sources present the accession of Nero and his early reign. I think it's important to note, obviously, that our sources have already introduced Nero when they were talking about Claudius, and there he's seen very much as a pawn of Agrippina. Agrippina is plotting to replace Claudius with Nero, and so although he's still essentially a child at the time and we haven't really seen him do anything with his own agency, he's already been introduced as a sort of an anti-hero in a way, and therefore when he accedes to the throne, it's presented as the triumph of Agrippina and her machinations against Claudius, and also as the usurpation of Britannicus, who is portrayed as the rightful heir to Claudius. The sources sort of ignore the fact that Nero was himself descended from Augustus and actually had a pretty good claim on the throne, certainly as good as Britannicus. Bear in mind that the Principate wasn't really established as a hereditary system at this point. Augustus had intended his grandsons and then his stepson to succeed him. Tiberius chose Caligula, not really having a son that he could pick on. So there isn't an expectation necessarily that the emperor's son should succeed him like there would be in a monarchy. And therefore, although Britannicus can be portrayed by the sources as having this really robust claim to power, equally Nero's claim to power is pretty strong. In the first few years of his reign then, he's portrayed as someone who's very much controlled by those around him. So here we've got Nero in the centre, give him a tick. And the three main influences on him, the sources say, are his mother, Agrippina, obviously, his tutor Seneca, and down here, this is Burrus. Well, it's not actually Burrus, it's a Praetorian prefect, but the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. So continuing that idea in the sources from Sejanus and then Macro under Gaius, that the Praetorian prefect is somebody with really significant influence over the emperor. And because Nero is only 16 at this time, he's seen as fairly easily manipulated. And it's not until a bit later in his reign that his own impulses and his own desires really seem to take precedence. I think it's really important to note that our sources for Nero are not only largely senatorial, so Tacitus and Dio obviously key ones, Suetonius not a senator himself, he's an equestrian but certainly affiliated with that order. They're also later sources, and that makes them more hostile to him. In fact, not very long after Nero was assassinated, Otho, so Nero's succeeded by Galba, Galba's succeeded by Otho, and Otho's able to garner support by portraying himself as a successor to Nero. So at least some sectors of society must have really liked Nero, even in the aftermath of his assassination. Similarly, a pretender called Terentius Maximus is able to gain quite a significant following in the East under Titus, so in the sort of 70s and 80s, 70s AD. So although the sources are portraying from the beginning Nero as somebody who is pretty bad and only ever able to be good because of these people's influence on him, that's not necessarily the case. We need to take that with a pinch of salt. So what do the sources say about his kind of early reign? Tacitus, as you can imagine, is pretty scathing. So he talks particularly about the way that Agrippina controls Nero. And if you can see here in chapter 2, this is book 14, he talks about Agrippina actually attempting to seduce Nero. So it's this idea of incest again that came up under Caligula with his sisters, basically as a means of keeping him under her control. He also talks back in book 12 about the way that Agrippina handles the death of Claudius and then the presentation of Nero. So according to Tacitus, Agrippina keeps Britannicus in his room, prevents him from leaving his room, so that Nero is able to be presented by Burrus to the rest of the Praetorians and then acclaimed as emperor. So there's a sense here that certainly Agrippina and Burrus are working together to promote Nero and to make sure that he's accepted as the emperor. Nero doesn't really do much to protest against this. This is a particularly nice coin from earlier in his reign. You've got Agrippina here on the right and Nero there on the left. Face to face, it's presented as a very much kind of equal relationship. And it's quite surprising to see a woman presented so prominently on coinage like this. When they do appear on coins, they're usually either on their own and the message is not so much of explicit power, or they're in the background, like we saw actually on that little gem relief of Claudius and Germanicus and their respective wives. Agrippina was in the background on that one. So this is from your Bradley photocopy, basically talking about the influences on Nero in his early reign. In his early years, the focus again is particularly on Agrippina. She starts to lose control, according to Tacitus, quite early on, but Seneca and Burrus are still there and able to kind of keep control. Now, one other really interesting thing is that Bradley talks about this quinquennium Neronis, this golden age of Nero, as lasting from 56 to 61. The OCR textbook dates it as 55 to 59 and says that it ends with the death of Agrippina. And it's interesting that actually the sources themselves don't really seem to have much consensus about exactly how long this quinquennium lasted for. So they all agree that Nero's early reign was kind of okay, but they can't quite decide when it was. So is it that the very first 5 years of Nero's reign, when Agrippina was controlling him, were good, and those are when he achieved all the kind of things that we can praise him for? Or do we discount the first couple of years where Agrippina's influence is so strong that we can't really consider Nero to be the emperor? And do we date this quinquennium as 56 to 61, i.e. the period when he's influenced by Seneca and Burrus, and then it's from 62, when Burrus and Seneca are kind of sidelined, got rid of, that Nero's kind of true nature starts to break out? So that's a question to think about as we look into our sources in a bit more detail. I think one final important thing to note is that Seneca and Burrus ultimately bring about their own demise by, certainly according to Tacitus, helping Nero to orchestrate the removal of Agrippina. So they're presented as the ones who kind of put the idea in his head that he can get rid of Agrippina. They see her as a bad influence. But by doing that, they give Nero the idea that he can just get rid of people who don't do what he wants them to do, or don't let him do what he wants to do.